Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar, Solar Panels, the Next Generation, brought to you by Solar Power World Magazine, live from the WTWH studios. We would also like to thank our generous sponsors, Allied Molded Products and Axitec LLC, who have helped us bring this content to you free of charge. We would also like to thank author, solar historian, and activist John Purlin and Paula Mintz of SPV Market Research for their insights into where solar panels have been and where they are going. I'm Frank Andorka, Editorial Director of Solar Power World, and I'll be your moderator today. Just a couple of housekeeping details before we get started. If you wish to tweet about this webinar anytime during or after, you can use the hashtag SolarWebinar. We love social media, and we hope you do too. You can follow us at Solar Power World or me at SolarFrankA. We will have a Q&A session after the presentations. Go ahead and submit your questions, and we will ask them after all the presenters are finished. Questions can be asked using the GoToWebinar on your screen, and presenters will be available to answer the questions after the presentations. Before we start, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, John Purlin, whose latest book, Let It Shine, The 6,000-Year Story of Solar Energy, is now available on Amazon.com. John is a lecturer and consultant at the University of California, Santa Barbara Department of Physics and Student Affairs. He and his Nobel laureate colleagues, Drs. Walter Kohn and Alan Heeger, produced the film The Power of the Sun, a 55-minute presentation showing how Einstein's discovery of the photon helped lead to the development of today's booming photovoltaic industry. As we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the first practical solar panels, John will give us a brief overview of how we got to where we are today in the solar panel segment. John?
Hi. I'm ready. Will my slides come on, please? Thank you. It all began in 1875 when people discovered that a certain material called selenium could produce electricity directly from sunlight. And as this slide shows, 50 years later, people still could not squeeze out enough energy, or you might say efficiency, from the selenium panels. And so the power, but it remained the power of the future, and people could dream that one day we could have a solar cell that could produce useful amounts of power. That the first solar cell was discovered in 1875, and that was called the selenium solar cell. Unfortunately, its efficiency was very low, and no matter what scientific advances, including Einstein's great discovery that light comes down as particles, which is basically making Einstein the father of the photovoltaic industry, could not help any improvement. So people began to wonder, you know, they began to ask, unless we find some new material, we'll never be able to produce electricity from the sun. Then in 1952, the Bell Laboratories had a remote power project. Daryl Chapin, who's shown in this photograph, started using the selenium cells with very poor results, as usual. But at the same time, going on in semiconductors, and that was diffusing foreign contaminants in very organized but small quantities into silicon. And this is how we developed the first semiconductors. And one of these semiconductors was exposed to sunlight. And lo and behold, suddenly a efficiency of 6 times the amount of selenium was discovered. And Gerald Pearson who was the witness to this major change in efficiency, ran down the hall to his colleague who was working with selenium and said, "Throw away that selenium. Let's start working with silicon." And the Silicon Revolution was born. But that required a lot of work, because it was like Columbus, once he no longer could see Europe and all he could see was open sea. No one had ever worked with a material that could convert so much sunlight into electricity. The first conversion was 2.7%, but they went and changed the lithium, which would migrate too quickly to phosphorus, and they started getting amazing results like 4%. And here we see presenting to the world the first solar cell that could produce useful amounts of electricity. And this is basically history as the future, because these were N-type wafers, which we're just beginning to use again today with boron on top. Also, what made these revolutionary was the contacts were not on the top of the cell, but they were, as we now use with the IBC cells, they're in the back. And suddenly, the news media picked this up. The Bell Health, the New York Times, for example, said this discovery, the discovery of the silicon solar cell, may mark the beginning of a whole new era where sunlight can produce all the energy needed for civilization, realizing the greatest dream of humanity. And here we see from U.S. News and World Report a article that says, "Silicon strip powerhouses, the future limitless." However, right out of the laboratory, how could we use these silicon solar cells? At first, it became very frustrating because all of the silicon solar cells were being used were to be powering little toys. And the inventors thought they were going to change the world like in a day, and became very, very depressed. However, the space race came, and there was no way to connect power lines to an object that needed power 300, 400 kilometers or miles above the Earth's surface. The first three satellites only used batteries, and they all died in 2 or 3 weeks. And then the Vanguard Satellite, the first solar-powered satellite, went up. No one expected it to work. For some reason, no one expects solar energy to work. And after 75 million miles of orbits, it was still like sending in messages. And so suddenly, we had the first real use of photovoltaics, and a whole new photovoltaic industry was born, because the solar cell became the integral component of every satellite. Now, with solar working so well up in the sky, the question was, can't we use this power source down to Earth? And Elliot Berman began fooling around with solar cells to make them cheaper, because they no longer had to be protected against radiation and other problems such as that for terrestrial uses. Now,
John,
here
we've had
I
a
think,
couple of John, I'm sorry to interrupt. We've had a couple of requests for you to please speak up. So
okay.
If you could
How's that?
that's
Is
better.
that better?
Thank you. Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
But I don't have to go back, do I?
No.
Okay, here I say if my presentation today was worthless, this photograph is worth everything. Here we see the two power sources juxtaposed. The oil industry became the first user of photovoltaics because they had the need for remote power. And no, this is not a photovoltaic array powering an oil derrick, but what it is, it's sending electricity in the ground to protect the well casement and the pipelines so the oil can be transported to where it is needed to be used. In fact, this technology, which is called cathodic protection, saved the entire world from losing its oil supply, because in 1981, a great oil leak happened in Saudi Arabia, polluting their biggest aquifer. And the king said, no more oil unless you can protect the pipes. And every third mile, a cathodic protector powered by the sun went in. Also, one of the first uses of the new photovoltaics on Earth was for buoys. And the reason is, once again, it was orderly movement of niches that the photovoltaic cells satisfied. And this niche was the fact that it cost more to put the batteries in a buoy than it did the buoy itself. And using solar cells with secondary batteries was far cheaper. So by the 1980s, the photovoltaics became the power source for all navigational aids throughout the world. Now, this is not a solar-powered camel, but it's photovoltaics being used to keep the cold chain going for vaccines as you transport these vaccines from the port to the hospitals. Once again, photovoltaics providing a life-saving use. There was a great drought in the Sahel in the 1970s, and Father Vesperian, who was the advisor to how to get water to the people in the Sahel, which is in the just south of the Sahara, said there's a great marriage between the sun and water. And here we see photovoltaics once again saving lives by pumping water so people did not die of thirst. Another niche that photovoltaics began satisfying was distant remote communications. And here we see in the state of Utah the microwave repeaters powered by photovoltaics. Now, photovoltaics went hand in hand with other parts of the semiconductor revolution.
Hey, John, I'm sorry to interrupt, John. I'm sorry to interrupt again, but you've gotten quiet again.
Oh, is this good? Okay.
That's much better. If you can hold the phone or whatever.
I'll hold the phone. Okay, great. Okay.
Thank you.
Here we see the semiconductor revolution going hand in hand with each other. The very low demanding transistor for power requiring only a few watts of photovoltaics. Once again, an orderly movement towards more and more photovoltaics as the uses are discovered. Now, this shows how little energy is used in the developing world. This is a 12-watt photovoltaic array that produces all the power for a Kenya house. But what it does is provide something that's so valuable, and that is light. Otherwise, these people would be using candles, or they might be using kerosene lamps, which would burn their eyes, and also causing CO2 pollution, and also causing terrible respiratory illnesses. Once people have good light, good light and thanks to photovoltaics, is more effective as a birth control method than any contraception movement. And here we see in the developing world, in the developed world, and the two combinations that move photovoltaics from the niche that niches that they were satisfying to the world revolution today was the German feed-in tariff, which was a daring scheme to bring huge amounts of photovoltaics to the world, and the very inexpensive modules provided by the Chinese. And that's my show today, and I'm open for any questions, and I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks, John. Now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, who probably needs no introduction from me, but I'd like to introduce to you Paula Mintz of SPV Market Research. Paula is the founder and chief market research analyst of the global solar market for the research firm SPV Market Research. Paula provides classic market research products based on primary research and is focused on the supply and demand sides of the solar industry and its technologies. Because of her willingness to tell solar audience unvarnished truths instead of what it wants to hear, Paula also speaks at several high-profile conferences a year, including IEEE, PVSC, the EU PVC SEC, Intersolar Europe, and Intersolar North America, as well as others. All of Paula's work is based on primary research of the supply and demand sides of the solar industry. Without further ado, I turn the mic over to Paula Mintz.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that really nice introduction, and thank you, John, for that very interesting trip down solar history lane, and very good education in the applications of the industry, because I did notice there were some technical problems. First of all, I will speak up, and I'm loud anyway. And if I know that I'm having problems getting my slides to move, I will probably just turn it over to you guys so that we can kind of whip right through this thing, huh? Anyway, good afternoon, morning, or whatever it is wherever you are. Let me see if I can get this sucker moving. Yes, there we go. You've already heard who I am. You already know this is primary research. Because we didn't really, that I heard, talk a lot about technology history, I unfortunately did not include slides on the technology history, but I'll just give you a little bit of it. So crystalline, of course, was the first commercial solar technology, and actually there's solar technology still in the field that was installed 35, 40 years ago. It's amazing. It's amazing. Reliable technology. So, you know, we're here to stay, we're here to power more of the world, and we're here to displace more conventional energy. Oops, my politics are showing. Thin films, Amorphous, which is in, you know, very sort of not in its ascension anymore, was the first commercial thin film technology. And the goal of developing amorphous silicon technology was lower costs. That's always been the goal of the industry. In my opinion, we should be focusing on selling the value of solar as opposed to the polluting, you know, as compared to the polluting, you know, aspects of conventional energy. But that's just me and maybe all of you. Anyway, so amorphous, it might surprise some of you to know, and granted there was a much smaller market at those days, and if I'd known there was less talk about the history of technology, I would have included a slide or two, was about 30% of global supply in the 80s. Those were during the days of the consumer indoor watches and calculators application. The CAD-TEL was the first successful and the second successful and largely deployed thin film technology, and the only manufacturer currently producing commercial CAD-TEL technology is for solar. So after that we have CIGS and CIS, which is still struggling to make gains in the market, and that's because this technology takes an extremely long time to produce. one hopes that with the Honergy acquisitions of several different CIGS technologies that we might see some standardization in production and perhaps stronger deployment. Nonetheless, any solar is good solar to me. So I'm going to whip through some of these history slides, and then I will talk about what I see coming up in the future, perhaps. First of all, just a caveat to brand new, big bang technologies, solar technologies in the future. Everything that we will see in the next 10 years is already in the lab. It's already being, commercialized and has been worked on for years and years and years. What you should do is look at conferences like the EU PVSec and also the IEEE to see what the universities, which are still the sort of the parents of our next-gen PV technologies, UNSW, Dr. Martin Green, if you ever have a chance to hear him speak, you certainly get a good idea of where we're going in terms of PV technologies. But, candidly, they're far in the future. You're looking at from laboratory, from idea to commercialization, still pretty close to 15 or 20 years. So what you're seeing now coming out in type, et cetera, more back contact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Different companies with, say, Sanyu was a precursor, Panasonic now is HitCell, have been in the laboratory for years and years and years. Anyway, moving along. This slide is a demand and supply slide. Since I skipped right through my methodology slide, basic market research, what was shipped is what was bought. That is demand and supply. It's like an accounting ledger. So this is what happened in 2013. China's share of global shipments decreased somewhat because they began outsourcing for product for the cell technology that they shipped, the manufacturers that they shipped to the US and that they shipped to Europe. And that's why you see, I'm not showing a comparison here, but there was growth in Taiwan, shipments from Taiwan, which unfortunately may be truncated given the tariff situation in the US, and also in ROW, rest of the world manufacturers, that's India, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. Japan does not have enough capacity to fill its own demand, so much of Japan's fine manufacturers' capacity and technology is captive to Japan right now, which is a shame. US has been losing technology share for a very long time, many reasons, and if you could ask me some questions, I will, about that, I'm happy to answer them or send me an email later. So on the demand side, you can see that China is definitely growing in its use of the technology and will for the next couple of years. Japan, of course, yes, they're fit. I expect you'll see more deployment in China if indeed the tariff situation continues to worsen. Oceania, North America, US, as you can probably see, does not have enough technology manufactured to fulfill its own demand. Latin America is starting to grow, and Europe is shrinking. So, move my mouse around, there we go, yippee! So, here is a global capacity, production, shipments, and inventory. And most of this, by the way, is crystalline. So, crystalline at this point is 97–98% of global shipments. That's a bit of a shame, even for amorphous, even less. I personally believe that there's a place in the universe for all solar technologies, including CSP, including CPV, all the thin films, and maybe a little, even organic, even the dye sensitized, which are honestly best used indoors because they have the unfortunate attribute of not working well in the sun. So, but anyway, this is how I look at the industry. I count all of these things. Capacity, you can see the growth there, grew by a compound annual rate of 34%, production 44%, shipments 44%, and inventory. So I'm counting all those at all times so that I can see what's possible. It's very important to look at inventory because, well, for me, it's very important to look at everything. It's also very important to absolutely make sure you can understand what manufacturers are capable of producing. So, for example, and I'm not going to name the manufacturer, last year a large manufacturer from China announced 3.7 gigawatts of shipments or something like that when they only have capacity for 2.4. Beware of announcements. If a manufacturer has capacity for 2.4, unless they can make up the difference in inventory, they were buying it from somewhere else. And for me, it's crucial to understand that. So there we go. Boy, do these slides move slowly, pardon me. This is a cost ASP, which is average prices in shipments from 2003 to 2013. Now, what people do not understand and seem to refuse to understand about the solar industry is the very low prices during the, I would say, 2009 through just the beginning of 2013 days were below the cost of production. So you have to be very careful, again, with announcements about prices and costs, because you don't know what costs they're actually talking, about in the first place. But the full cost is the full cost, and it's a complicated subject. Nonetheless, you can see that during the 2009 through beginning of 2013 days, manufacturers were forced to were selling below the cost of production, and that's why you have this like ugly little green line down there. This, of course, as we all remember in this industry, drove quite a few good manufacturers out of business. Heavy consolidation still going on a little bit. Our capacity situation has straightened out somewhat, so utilization is higher, but there is continued building and continued capacity additions in an industry such as solar that relies still on government incentives. I personally think that adding capacity is such a difficult decision for any manufacturer in solar, because you could be caught holding quite a bit of that inventory, and excess capacity is a cost. So if you're producing a lot and you're actually utilizing well, that doesn't mean you're actually shipping it from your factory. And in the end, it doesn't actually mean you're shipping it at a price that you can actually maintain quality and R&D, et cetera. Isn't that sad? Aren't I depressing? How sad. Everybody's going to fly off the call now. Don't do that. Anyway, here's technology shares 2011 to 2013. They're really, I can break down the crystalline into some of the newer technologies we're starting to see there. And again, they're not new. They've been in the lab for 10 years, 20 years. They've been under production. Technologies of the future, quantum dots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are years away from commercialization. So what I'm really, I guess the real point is, this is already an amazing technology, as I'm sure John made very clear, and the ability of right now the focus is more on the module assembly, getting, frames that are lighter, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Also, balance of systems, more reliable inverters. Storage is huge, and huge in terms of focus, by the way. Let's hope that money results in storage technologies that actually do jetson our industry into the next decade or so, and allows us to take a higher percentage from conventional, higher share from conventional energy. Nonetheless, this is what we're looking at now. Ribbon is no more. You notice I put the 2011 pie on just to show that ribbon is no more. Ribbon was just, I think, just pre-commercial, coming into commercial shipments when I started in 1997. So it had a brief heyday, and the focus on ribbon was saving money. It was a different technology, different way of manufacturing crystalline, that the assumption would be less expensive and at least on par with the current efficiencies of the day. It did not outlast the low pricing, unfortunately. Now we see some concerns with amorphous silicon, with CAD-TEL, of course, is probably here to stay, and CIGS really has not yet achieved its promise, so we'll have to see what Honergy and other CIGS and CIS manufacturers do with that. Moving along, forecast for the future, I still think it's a crystalline world, and I don't think there's a lot of disagreement. It's always fascinating to me when people announce the death of one technology sector or over another, given how long I know it takes to actually develop this technology. So I would say, I remember back in the 2005 to 2008 days, the announcement and the expectation was that crystalline was on the wane. It was the old technology. It was the elephant in the room. It was boring. And the crystalline sessions were poorly attended in those days at conferences. Thin film sessions were packed. But, and I said that this then, and it proved true, that if crystalline was less expensive, even though it was less expensive than it should have been, that thin film technologies would have a difficult time competing, and that is indeed what happened. They've not really recovered other than for solar, and this is what I'm seeing going into the future. I'm also seeing a lot of technology out there, at least for the next couple of years. We're looking like we're in the accelerated shipment stage, but that will not last. I believe that just yesterday or today there was an announcement from Ohio that was, I mean, not that that's a huge solar state, turning back the clock on renewable incentives, et cetera. So, never say never for even the bad stuff, unfortunately. And that's about it. So I'm sorry for whipping through, but I wanted to leave plenty of time for questions. And this is my favorite quote, by the way. And here we can please ask questions. Pelt me with questions. Insult me, please. That was a joke. I can't hear you laughing, of course. Thank you, Frank. Frank, is anybody there but me?
No, I'm here. I just had a little bit of a problem unmuting my microphone. I apologize.
Oh, okay.
Thanks, Paula.
I'm sorry for whipping through, but I did notice we were getting short on time, and I did want to leave it open for questions.
Yes, no, I do really appreciate that. I have a quick question for you, because I've heard you say before, and I heard you say here, that thin film is really going to struggle when it comes to competing with crystalline solar. And what do you make of the Solar City acquisition of Solevo, which is well, they're sort of a hybrid thin film crystalline mix, but they do have a thin film quality to them. So I was curious as to what you thought about that.
Well, they're crystalline technology. They're manufactured in China, I believe, and they are not commercial yet. They're still basically in pilot scale. So if they're shipping, I would have to get more data on that. But it's an announcement. Announcements are not data, and it says more about Solar City and probably Elon Musk than it does about Solevo. Essentially, they are vertically integrating, and that's a trend. It also makes sense with the lease business model, because you do really need to keep your costs down in order to show the extremely large margins that you will be able to realize later on. So again, it's more interesting in terms of what Solar City is thinking. It's not, and I'm sorry, I've seen a lot of announcements. I don't consider this groundbreaking. I think the odds of them in 2 years having a 1 gigawatt cell facility are approaching zero, if not zero. And the odds of them having a 1 gigawatt module facility in New York are also, approaching zero. And given or slightly higher, maybe in the teens, I expect you'll see them do modules. They may do, I don't know what they're going to do. Right now it's just an announcement, but I don't get excited about announcements until I see actual, things happening. Again, it helps them control costs, but there's a long discussion that can be had on, the ups and downs of vertical integration, particularly in the solar industry. There's a reason that solar manufacturing in the U.S. is struggling right now, and it'll be interesting to see what they do. So, for example, if they do not have their own cell capacity and they really do end up in 2 years with 1 gigawatt of module capability, where are they going to get the cells? And it indicates either that they're extremely positive about having that much demand for their lease, solar lease, and power purchase if they're doing that in 2 years, or and beyond, or it indicates that there's a conservative internal forecast of their own capabilities that we're not going to be able to see. So those are my thoughts.
Can I add a little anecdote? At UCSB, where I work, we're putting in 400 kWs of Solavo modules right now.
Then, John, anecdote though that may be, you still don't know whose cells are inside the Solavo modules, and 400
Sure.
kilowatts do not 1 gigawatt make.
I agree. I'm not arguing at all. I'm just.
So I'm not arguing, and I'm sorry to be harsh with you here, but I do think that just because it's in a Solavo frame, it doesn't mean it's a Solavo cell. And that I would hope that you would point out to people when you discuss this.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Can I just, the next question I have for both of you is, somebody asked, can you talk about the potential for black silicon?
You want to take that, John?
I've been a little bit in the, reading about it. It's basically an idea from NREL that NatCore has licensed, and the idea is to bring in more photons, basically to keep the photons in, and that's been actually a problem that was faced at Bell Laboratories, was how to keep the photons from leaving the cells before they were turned into electricity. So that's a continuing problem ever since silicon has been with us.
And from my perspective, this is pre-commercial, pre-pilot scale days. So being a conservative analyst and having observed that technology a bit in its papers, et cetera, it's way too early to see if this is going to, what market potential this has. Because again, as I pointed out, the timeline from R&D through pilot stage, which is all about repeatability, to commercialization, is a long one. And by the way, so back to the Solar City announcement, that would be what would concern me, is that I saw during the first high demand fit days a lot of truncated pilot scale timelines, and it's just, none of those manufacturers are producing commercially anymore. By the way, it is crucial that we not ship technology into the field before it is actually ready to be shipped and deployed.
Well,
Crucial.
one of the interesting things, once again historically, is the Bell solar cells were announced in 1954, and by 1958 they were on the Vanguard Satellite and other satellites that were crucial to the defense of the United States. So that's an amazing leap in 4 years from the laboratory to a practical application.
That leads into another question. I'm sorry, Paul.
No, that's okay.
That leads into another question we've had from the audience. Why are we still a decade away from new technology? And I find that question particularly interesting in light of John's comments on the first functional solar panels.
Well, again, and by the way, I think that story is a little more intricate than that. And in terms of the terrestrial world, where you're looking for something to last for 30 years, it's still, by the time something is announced, years and years and years and years have, predated that announcement. But I always quibble with that term, new technology. This technology is amazing now. It sits in the field. If it is appropriately and properly and diligently developed, and it generates electricity in some cases for over 30 years. And by the way, I actually didn't hammer this point home. In scientific circles right now, the point is longer than 25 years, which is what we've been saying. The point is to get that technology out there and have it last for up to 50. So the new frontier is really reliability. For something to be able to produce electricity for 25 years, forgetting longer. It should take more than a year or two to produce and develop. I mean, bottom line, it should. It's very, my God, it's hugely difficult to develop this technology. I mean, we could go into a very long discussion on that. Some of my, I have to say, some of my best friends are the pioneers of the industry, and I was at the IEEE last week. It was just amazing being around, you know, Martin Green again and being able to say hi to him, and Alan Barnett, and all these guys that are dedicated to developing the technologies of the future. It should take a long time. However, this technology is amazing now. We shouldn't keep wanting to see something new and different when we've already got technology that's amazing now. And technology advancement is slow, and you just see little iterative changes over time. That's what leads you to the big change. It's all these little iterative changes over time. It's not a big bang, and I think, unfortunately, that all over the world we've grown to expect that there's going to be some new amazing thing that happens out there when it's already new and amazing, in my humble opinion.
I have to totally agree with, and it's my pleasure to agree with Paula, that the beauty of silicon is that it works and works well, and it's really the only electronic technology that's forced to go under so much stresses, thermal stresses. It's the only electronic technology that's out, you know, in the field 24/7, you know, through all the seasons. And at a conference we put on, we even had Mort Prince, who was working in the technology in 1954 in the silicon technology. And it was amazing to hear him also talk about the work at Bell Laboratories. Yeah, it's just that silicon is an amazing, and also I think should be mentioned is the abundancy of silicon, the availability in the world as a material.
So the next question is, and this is for either of you, what's your take on the tariff effects, assuming commerce continues with what they've said they're going to continue with? What's your take on the tariff effects short term?
Who would you like to go first?
Oh, I'd love Paula to go first, because I might actually learn something, and then I can say something as a addendum.
Well, given that the U.S. has 2% of global capacity to produce the technology and not enough capacity to meet its own demand, given that most of our technology is imported, I'm just going to answer it this way. If I were a technology manufacturer in Malaysia, India, Singapore, yada, 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 the Philippines, we all know who that is, I would be looking askance at a market, even a solid market, that might turn on me in the future. Some of our technology is imported from Germany. So at this point, I can see both sides of the question, by the way. So the very low, and if you can remember that slide I showed you, below the cost of production technology that was available in the U.S. from imported technology, coupled with, it's not that the government does not support solar manufacturing at all. I don't think it does enough of it, and I might quibble with some of the choices that have been made. And, you know, invest in something that works, please. I mean, not that thin films don't deserve a chance. You have to take a risk too. But those things developed an environment where it was very hard for even module assemblers in the U.S. to compete. So I can see the side of people who are being driven out of business, who have been driven out of business because of this. And it's tragic as far as I'm concerned, because when companies, good strong companies, good small companies are driven out of business, you lose innovation, you lose ideas, you lose creativity. On the other hand, if I were someone looking to export my technology to the U.S. from Europe, any country in Europe, China, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, you know, India, the Philippines, I'd be asking myself some questions about how safe this market is, and I would be building risk into my price. So what we're going to see, I think there's no question we're already seeing, is higher prices. And that puts pressure back on the demand side. So there are many different sides that I can see of this, and I see unfortunate effects from the government not doing enough. One thing they could have done is add in higher incentives to buy U.S. manufactured goods, as well as supporting U.S. manufacturing more. And instead, we have this punitive tariff situation, which almost never actually works well. So that's my opinion.
Well, I'd like to say is, first of all, I think once again, Paula, is thank you. I would prefer to see us supporting the manufacturers rather than being punitive. But I think what's really interesting from a historical perspective is that silicon, solar cells, which are the solar cells that are being tariffed right now, was invented in the United States, and until about 1980 was 100% manufactured in the U.S. But due to anti-solar policies of the Nixon, the Carter, and the Reagan administration, especially the Reagan administration, they migrated first to Japan, then to Germany, and of course, this whole huge manufacturing in China.
Regarding China, though, that industry started up, and I didn't have some of these charts with me. Started from zero, just like 2002, and ramped up really fast. Basically imported technology knowledge from, I would call UNSW the father of China's crystalline silicon technology development. However, they developed that as an export market, which is fascinating. It's really only after the tariff situation and the slowdown in Europe that you saw a lot of activity start to happen in China. Given their era, that's a good thing.
I think also should be remembered that actually more money comes into the United States from China for photovoltaics. For example, the polysilicon industry, the various technologies that China uses then go out to China.
So we have a bunch of questions. So I'm going to try and get through as many as I can here. The next question is for both of you again. What do you think about CPV? Where is it going in the near and long term, and why?
Well, unfortunately, CPV has been affected by the industry has been affected by the extremely low prices for PV technologies. So right now, CPV is struggling. CPV, as I think I made clear earlier, all solar technologies, as far as I'm concerned, have a place in the world. And I would prefer to see as more of a focus and more education instead of on technology that's cheap on the value of solar industry, of solar technology, all the solar technologies. I'd like to see them deployed where they are more useful. I'd personally like to see more PV, more DG. CPV, CSP can be farther away from the load, though I think there is an argument for DG, CPV. Right now it's struggling, and it has to survive this period in order to start taking share. The share of CSP and the share of CPV are so small right now, in the solar universe, because solar in general has a small share globally. I think it's too early to tell. If you take a look at what's happened to Amorphous Silicon, and again, all the other solar technologies are sort of hamstrung by what has been for a few years the very inexpensive price of PV. So it's too early to tell.
I'd like to answer that from my book and from a historian's perspective. I think it's an amazing story of one technology concentrators, which were developed in the Bronze Age, connected to the latest breakthrough in the history of solar energy photovoltaics.
For Paula, what are the top 5 reasons why the U.S. can't compete in solar manufacturing?
The top 5? I don't think I need 5. Well, one is not a lack of consistent support for PV manufacturing in the U.S., government support, and coupled with, unfortunately, some interesting decisions along the way on what technologies to support that. Again, when you are supporting technology, you have to take risks as well as supporting what works. This is the same for Europe, by the way. For years, I'm still on the European Union's sort of technology platform committee. I'm as a sort of an expert now. I used to be more directly involved with working groups when there were working groups. There's I've noticed over time that there seems to be always a lot of discussion about things that goes on and on and on without real action taking place until it's almost too late. I mean, unfortunately, that seems to be the case. So number one, I think not a robust support on the government side. Number two, you had this wave of extremely inexpensive PV technology shipped into the country, and the U.S. manufacturers that were left could not compete. So that would be number two. And actually, those are enough. I don't need to find 3 more.
Can I answer the question a little bit? Is that historically, once again, in the Carter administration was asked by the Federal Energy Administration and the Defense Department to accelerate through buy downs photovoltaics to make it cheap, just like the Chinese, but it was vetoed by the Carter administration, and so we were left with high-cost PV.
But then again, I mean, I do want to hammer this home. That's sort of a market answer, and so yes, but I would argue and have argued for years that we need to stop selling cheap and sell long-term value. Once it's installed, if it's installed a high-quality installation, if it's high-quality technology, you're talking about decades of electricity. That's definitely worth something. Given the state of our environment now, where even Republicans are, you know, past EPA directors are actually now saying, look, this is a problem. Look at what we've done to our environment. We actually can't turn back the clock now. We have to do something now. There is a value to that we've stopped. I don't know. We aren't able to educate well enough to get it across. Cheap isn't the point. Long-term value and energy security and an environment that isn't you know, crumbling around us. I think those are the assets we need to be talking about.
Hey, Paula and John, when are we going to see commercial triple junction cells with efficiencies in the higher 30%?
I think we're a ways away from that, but we're certainly catching up. There are impressive results. But the CPV industry in general, I mean, that is, what a balancing act. You've got to make the optics, the cell technology, the optics, the tracking, it all has to work perfectly. So, you know, the demonstration modules, I wouldn't say that's definitely not trivial, but, you know, so the prototype stage, the commercialization is amazing, fascinating, so difficult. So it all has to work together perfectly and is beyond imagining difficult. So we're a ways away from that, but they certainly are making some amazing strides. I always go to the CPV sessions at the IEEE and in the EU PVSec because and I pay attention to the posters because it's fascinating to me. You know, the world records, of course, as we hopefully all know, are not commercial results. but they're definitely making gains that we should hopefully see in the field, and maybe within 10 years.
We have time for one more question. What do you think about the current situation of solar module connector technology? Those are the issues that our installers are thinking about.
I think I need a more specific question than that.
Well, I don't have a more specific question. Sorry.
Could the questioner ask something a little more? I mean, if that's a question coming from the audience?
Yes, this is a question coming from the audience.
Okay. I still think I need them to be more specific in what the issue of. Is it price? Is it technology? I don't want to answer a question in the wrong direction. So if whoever asked that question wants to send me an email later, I'm happy to respond to it.
Yeah, that's perfect. Well, I want to thank John and Paula for their excellent presentations today. And I want to point out too that John will be presenting a poster at Intersolar.
No, not presenting an they've actually, I'm doing an exhibit and a booth on the 60th anniversary of the silicon solar cell and the availability of Let It Shine, the 6,000-year story of solar energy.
Got it, John. Sorry about that. Paula, and are you going to be at Intersolar this year presenting?
Oh yeah, I'm on the committee, have been for years. So I'm chairing a session. I'm presenting on some work I've done on residential buyers, lessees, power buyers, buying experience in the process, as well as their owning experience. So I'll be doing that, and I'll be running around the exhibit area, and also I think giving a couple interviews. So of course I'll be there. It's our big party. Well, one of them.
Well, terrific. If you guys get a chance to go out and see either John or Paula at Intersolar, if you're going to be there, I highly, recommend you do that. If you have any additional questions for either John or Paula, you can send your questions to me at fandorka@solarpowerworld.com, and I'm happy to pass them along. Thanks, everyone, for attending this webinar from Solar Power World, and I'd again like to thank our sponsors who allowed you to view this webinar for free, Allied Molded Products and Axitec LLC. This presentation will be emailed to everyone later, either today or tomorrow, and will also be available at the website at solarpowerworldonline.com. Thank you, everyone.
You're welcome.